All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this first lecture of E4703, Wireless Communications. I'm Angel Lozano. This is the outline for today. We're going to go first over some course logistics and a bit of syllabus. So this part will be, in some sense, a pre-lecture part. And then we'll get into the first lecture properly. So my idea for today is to go over some introductory topics to try to motivate the course so that those of you who may still undecided may make up your mind as to whether you're interested in following this course or not. Hopefully you will. So the topics I want to touch on are very briefly something called the wireless vision, which is what's been driving this incredible growth in wireless communications in the last few years. Then I want to spend a bit of time talking about applications and about the requirements that these applications have, and then the challenges that meeting these requirements places on a wireless system. Then spend a few words to convey some basic notions of traffic theory at a very high level. That's all we're going to need. Then I've put together a brief historical tour of the main developments in the short but pretty intense history of this field of wireless communication. Hopefully you'll find this kind of fun. And then I want to tell you a bit about spectrum regulation and standards so that you get an idea of how all the theory that we're going to learn in this class ends up being translated into an actual product that you can have in your hands and use. And I'm sure that most of you do. Then the most serious part of today's lecture is this bullet point that says the cellular concept. So this notion of having a system built on the basis of cells is probably the most important idea at the core of how cellular systems are architectured today. So I'll go over what the guiding principles are, come on in, for this idea of a cellular system. It has a number of interesting implications. So we'll look at that. And then I'd like to finish today with a bit of a system classification. So different wireless systems today, and the number of systems is growing, so there's more and more. So it's kind of useful to have them classified according to some basic metrics so that we can see how they relate, how they compare, how they differ, etc. So that's what I'd like to go over today. Any questions? All right, so let's go over the course logistics. So this is some information about myself. I worked at this place, Bell Laboratories. It's the research and development arm of Lucent Technologies, which is a company that manufactures telecommunications equipment. It's based in New Jersey, across the river. This is my email, which is by far the best way to reach me. By the way, the fact that I'm in the industry, and so the department has asked me to give this course this semester, but I'm not a regular member of the faculty. That's why there is only one session per week. I'm sure that most of you, come on in. Yeah, come on in. So I'm sure most of you prefer 2 short sessions as opposed to 1 long session, but unfortunately it's hard for me to come over here twice a week. So I'll try to make it easy on you and give you a nice break in the middle of the session so we can all stretch our legs and unwind. I understand it's hard to keep concentration steady for 2.5 hours, so we'll try to make it easy on everybody. So that's my email, as I said. I will have office hours here on Thursdays. The nominal times are 1:30 to 3:30, but you can pretty much come any time between lunch and the starting time for the next lecture. So I'll be in the adjunct professor office, which is room 1312, right upstairs. The TA for this course is Erksm. Let's see if I can pronounce the name. He's at the back of the room. Pneumatikakis. Close enough, eh? Erksm will have office hours, right? You will? All right, so I have to change this, and so I'll change this. All right. I will update. Yeah, anyway, I'll update the slides to put the correct information, and then we'll have these slides posted on the web, so on the class webpage. So you can just go and check it out. Okay, so I think that's about it for me and for FQS. This is a bit of a marketing slide about Bang Ops. Let you look at it on your own if you have the inclination. So let's talk about the course itself. First, about prerequisites. Basically, what you need to know to come here and follow the course without too many problems is some basic notions on communication signals and systems. There is a course here, I understand, which is E3701, which tackles exactly these topics. So if you've taken that, you should be fine. If you've taken a similar course, you should be fine. Unfortunately, this semester, this course is offered exactly on Thursdays at the same time. So there's no way you can take both wireless and E3701. If you took it last year, that would be great. If you haven't taken it, you can probably do some reading and catch up on your own. The most important things that you need to know is an understanding of Fourier transformations between the time and frequency domains, and then some notions on random variables and random processes. Now, if you're rusty on this, if you haven't been exposed for a while or you just haven't been exposed, there is a very nice appendix in the textbook that deals with these issues, and that covers all that we'll need for the class and more. So I think it's Appendix B in the textbook, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's Appendix B. So it's pretty short. It's about 8 or 10 pages. And if you're proficient in that, you should be all right. If you have specific doubts and concerns about this, come talk to me in the break or after the lecture. I'll try to direct you. So speaking of the textbook, this is it. It's entitled Wireless Communications, of course, by Professor Andrea Goldsmith. It's a new release. This book was just published in September, just a few months ago. And in fact, Professor Goldsmith has told me that she would be grateful if any of you happen to catch a typo. She's preparing the second edition, and they're still finding a few mistakes and incorrections. So if you find something and you report it, and if it's a good one, I'll give you some credit on your homework. There's another book I want to tell you about. It's also a pretty new book. It was published less than a year ago. It's called Fundamentals of Wireless Communication by Professors David Se at Berkeley and Professor Pramod Viswanath at Illinois. It's a very nice book also. It's a bit more advanced, but it may be useful to give you a different perspective from some of the topics. So if you want, you can use it as a reference book. I'll give you some pointers on which of the sections and chapters are relevant to each of the topics. You don't have to, but it can be useful. We will have a homepage for the class. FQs, right? We'll have a homepage. I don't have the website address yet, but we'll send it out, right? All right, we'll send it out. So we'll post there, homeworks, announcements. I'll post the slides that I'll be using so that you can look at them on your own if you want. And as you know, the sessions is just once a week on Thursdays. The course is worth 3 credits. I understand bounded towards any degree. The grading will be based on homework, midterm, and final. So the breakup will be 20% for the homework, 30 for the midterm, and 50 for the final. The homeworks will be assigned starting next week on Thursday on the lecture or right after the lecture. We'll put them on the web. And they'll be due the next week before the lecture. And CBN students should follow the CBN procedures, of course. Then the midterm exam will be on the week of March 9th. And the final will be on the week of May 11th. And I think there is a break week after the midterm, right? You guys know that better than me. Any questions? No, sorry, that meant to say midterm and final, right? Point. Is that better? Just one midterm. Other questions? Alrighty, so what I hope to accomplish in this course is mostly to provide you a broad coverage of all the major themes that are relevant to the operation of a wireless system. So it's going to be a course mostly about breadth. But I also want to have it some depth. So there are a few topics that I'm hoping to get into in some amount of detail. And these are topics that are that distinguish a wireless system from any other type of communication system. So there are a few topics at least that I want to get into, which are first, the mobile radio channel, which is the medium that a wireless system uses to convey the information around, and which has a lot of peculiarities. Then something called multiple access that we'll be defining later in today's lecture. And then something called interference management that we'll also define later in the lecture today. So mostly breadth and a bit of depth. All right, so here's the syllabus. Introduction is today. Then there'll be one lecture dedicated to antennas and propagation. That will be next week. Then we'll get into the mobile radio channel in quite some detail. So that should take between 1 and 2 lectures, depending on how quickly we proceed. Then we'll spend about 1 lecture on capacity of wireless channels. So actually, course on information theory taught this semester, which is somewhat more advanced. So we'll be just touching it more superficially. Then we'll talk digital, I would think. Lecture. Diversity should be 1 lecture. We will see. Communication. So we'll talk about multi-access and about interference management, maybe a couple lectures each. So it should add up to about 13 lectures, I think, more or less. Questions? All right, so that's what I had in terms of logistics. If there's no questions, we can go ahead and start with the introductory material. And then we'll take a break at around, let's see, what time is it now? Now it's 4:25. We'll take a break at around 5:10 or 5:15, 15-minute break. Okay, let me tell you a bit about the wireless vision. This is what has driven the industry in the last few years. So the traditional vision is this one. You want to have multimedia communication wherever you are, whenever you want, using some portable device. It can be a phone, a laptop, a palm top, anything at all. This applies to, or used to apply, this vision used to apply to person-to-person communication. And it encompasses a variety of systems. So here I've listed them according to their geographical coverage. Later we'll classify them in different ways. But we have satellite systems, we provide very broad coverage. Their aim is to provide coverage everywhere on the Earth. We have paging systems, also with very wide coverage. We have cellular systems that provide pretty wide coverage, although not as wide. There are places where there is no coverage. For example, if you go on a boat off the shore, at some point your coverage will cease, whereas in a satellite system, you'll continue to retain coverage. There are ad hoc networks. I'll talk about that later today. And there are wireless LANs, which are local area networks. So that's what you're using if you have a laptop with Wi-Fi, for example. If you're browsing the web from Starbucks or something like that, that's the class of system that you're using, a wireless LAN. Then there's something called PAN, which stands for Personal Area Networks. So this is something pretty new. An idea is that you have these little gadgets that talk to each other, pretty much. So the personal network is essentially around your body. So you can have, like, your phone, for example, can talk to a headset without a wire, using something called, which I'll tell you about. So it's a short-range radio that goes from your phone, just like 2 or 3 feet to the headset. You can have your MP3 player talking to a headset. You can have these devices talking to each other, your player talking to your camera. All that type of stuff, that forms what it's called the personal area network. So that has a very restricted coverage. These signals don't go very far, just a few feet away, but that's all they need, etc. So all these systems are geared towards letting people communicate with other people. That's the traditional vision. Now this vision is increasingly being expanded to incorporate communication between people and machines, and even between machines, right? So we can have, for example, sensors or remote controllers that are sending information to other controllers. Why are the providers interested in having machines communicate? Well, because they're running out of people, essentially. As you'll see in a little bit, a large fraction of the Earth's population already has a cell phone. So if you want to keep growing the business, you need to find new customers. So there's many machines in the world, an estimated 50 billion machines that could incorporate communication. So that's why there's so much interest in having machines communicate. It's a very big market. There's also something called fixed wireless access, which is getting some momentum. And this is kind of ironic because traditionally wireless has been used to communicate to people that are on the move, right? You use wireless because you want to be able to move around without a cable. Now, people are using wireless to compete with cables. So for example, as an alternative to DSL or cable, you can provide service to buildings or to offices or to companies via wireless, right? You can have a building with apartments. You put a big antenna on the roof, point it to another antenna that's somewhere else, and you can provide internet service for all the customers in the building, for example. So you could do that using DSL or using cable. You can also do that using wireless. And that's called fixed wireless because this terminal is not going to move. It's going to be in the roof, it's going to be planted there, pointed, it's going to be fixed. But it's going to be using wireless. So as you can see, the vision is very broad. And it's grown to a large extent because of the growth in the applications. So let's talk about the applications. This list used to be very short. Up until maybe 10 years ago, all you could do with a cellular phone was just talk. You could just make phone calls. Now the list has grown very long, and these are the ones I came up with. Just thinking about it myself for a little bit. I'm sure that I've missed quite a few of them. So the ones I came up with are, of course, voice, telephony, still the main one. Then there is text messaging, which is not so popular here in the US for some reason, but it's all the rage in Europe and in the Far East. So you go to Europe and teenagers are always messaging each other. It's much cheaper than making a phone call. So you can send a text message for maybe 15 cents. So it's a very good way of communicating when you have a low budget. Very popular in most of the world. Then we have still pictures. Now, most cell phones come equipped with cameras. And in fact, I think today it's hard to find a cell phone that doesn't have a camera. So the idea is that you take a picture, and the quality may not be very good, but they are getting better. And then you can just upload this picture using the cell phone itself, right? So you don't have to connect it to your computer. You just you send your button, you press your button, and you pay, of course, and you send the picture to your friends. For example, you're traveling somewhere, you take a picture, send it to your friends. Then there is video, which is still very incipient, but getting started. There is service now in some European places. You can get short videos, for example, with news or sports. Like you can get the highlights of the sports of the weekend, for example, sent to you, maybe like just 2 or 3 minutes. And you're in an airport, for example, waiting for an airplane, you can get it zipped to your phone. And you can do some video conferencing already. You can have, if you have a camera in your phone, you can do video conferencing. So video is catching up. There is, of course, web browsing, very popular with laptops, with Wi-Fi. File transfer, right? Imagine that I want to send you guys these slides from my laptop. I can do it wirelessly today. I could do it with Verizon. I need a little card that I connect to my laptop, and it's going to allow me to upload this file wherever I want. Then there is gaming, something that's growing very fast. It has interesting requirements, so we'll see that in a little bit. So the idea is you can have multiple people playing video games using their phones or similar maybe special consoles, I guess. So you can have, you can be playing with somebody who's in San Francisco or something, real time, tennis or basketball or whatever. Big application also is sensing and remote control. There's a lot of interest in these applications. For example, you have, say you have here in Colombia, you have vending machines for Cokes, right? So typically, a guy has to come in every once in a while to refill the machine, take the money out, maybe the machine is broken. So you put a little wireless device on the machine, and it can just report. For example, when it's running out of Coke, it can just report back. So you know when you can send the technician, right? These kind of things. For example, parking meters, same thing, right? Parking meters in New York City. The thing of coins is full, has to be emptied, and send a little radio signal, and somebody comes in. Military. As many applications as you can imagine. You saw this news about Pakistan last week. They sent one of these airplanes without pilot to throw a bomb, right? So control, wireless, of course. So anything that you want to control remotely, wireless. Communication between tanks and airplanes, whatever, all wireless. A lot of investment now. So there's something called quality of service, which refers to the needs of a given application, right? Think about the applications we saw in the last slide, right? So in order to function properly, each application has certain needs. So here I've classified the needs of the applications in 4 categories. First is data rate. Let's say R in bits per second. So this is a measure of speed, right? Some applications require a lot of speed, others don't. Then we have something called BER, which stands for bit error rate, which is a measure of quality, right? So this tells us how much tolerance an application can have to errors, right? Imagine we're sending a signal composed of a number of bits. Some of the bits are flipped over, and they're received they're mistaken, right? Is that a problem or not? Well, for some applications, it's not a big problem. For other applications, it's critical. All the bits have to be received correctly. So that's a measure of quality. A third class of requirements is latency, which stands for delay, say latency in milliseconds. So some applications are very resilient to delay. They work fine, even if there is delay in the signal. Others are not. Others are very sensitive. So there was just no work at all. For example, video gaming, right? That's an easy one. Then there are a couple of other QoS categories that are specific to voice communication, to telephony. So one is blockage. So this is the chance that you try to make a phone call and you have no line, right? The line is busy. There are no circuits in that cell where you are. There's no channels are available. So you're blocked. You can try later. So the blocking probability should be small, otherwise people get upset. And then the dropping probability is the chance that you can drop during a call, which is very annoying and should be kept to a minimum. So these quality of service requirements vary very widely depending on the application. For example, voice. Voice requires on the order of 10 kilobits per second for just a decent quality. It's not too much speed. It's pretty low. It can tolerate easily a bit error rate of or the order of 10 to the minus 3, right? So even if 1 bit out of 1,000 is decoded in error, it's all right. It won't be noticeable. Now, if it's much higher than that, the quality of the voice will start suffering. Now, latency is pretty important in voice. It should not exceed about 1, maximum 200 milliseconds. Otherwise, it becomes very hard to talk on the phone, right? I'm sure most of you have been through the experience of talking to the phone on a satellite connection where the delay is about half a second. So you talk, and then you stop, wait for the other person to answer, but the other person is still receiving your signal with some delay. So you don't hear back from them, then you talk again and you step on them, or they step on you. That's because of delay. And it's pretty critical. So once it gets above about 200 milliseconds, it's noticeable. It gets very annoying, right? The other person is non-responsive. And the blockage probability, typically wireless systems try to aim for no more than 3% blocking. So If you block more than 3% of the time, the quantity is not very good. So we can classify the applications we saw a couple of slides ago according to these 4 categories, right? We can go, I'm going to deal with this table on your own if you want, but let's go over it very quickly. Voice, we already covered that. Messaging needs very low data rate. If you want to send a text message, that's just a bunch of bits, very few. So the rate requirement is very low. However, latency tolerance is very high, right, for a message. You get a message, if it's received in a few seconds or in a couple of minutes, typically it doesn't matter. The delays can be very high, actually. For example, I got a Happy New Year text message on January 2nd. So it was sent, so it was tagged as sent January 1st at like 12:15 a.m., right after midnight. And it took 24 hours to get through the network because everybody was sending, Happy New Year messages or something. But it's all right. It got there. This is a bit extreme, but delays of a few seconds are completely okay. A few minutes also are fine for messages. It's like email. Picture, same thing, right? You can send a picture. If it gets there in half a minute, it's still all right. But the data rate is very high, right? Sending a picture takes a lot of bandwidth. So that's high here. BR, tolerance is pretty low. If there are mistakes in a picture, you're going to see it, right? For example, colors are going to be flipped. Something that was green is going to be red or blue, so you can see it. Same for video. Video is pretty much like voice, except it requires more data rate. But other than that, it's pretty similar. In fact, video has also voice attached to it. It has video and audio. Web browsing is pretty important. It has a low data rate. Latency is medium. Usually when you get annoyed if a page doesn't load after a few seconds, but usually you click, if it takes 2 or 3 seconds, it's all right. So hundreds of milliseconds are not a problem. So I would say medium. File transfer has a high data rate requirement because, for example, this set of slides that I'm using today, these are 5 megabytes. That's a lot of stuff to send. Right? So files can be very big these days. BR tolerance is very low, right? If there is an error in one of the bits when I send this file, well, it depends. Maybe we'll flip one of these letters. No big problem. You can still read it. But if it's in an equation, for example, we can flip something in an equation. That can be pretty bad. And finally, gaming has no data rate. Usually, you just send a few bits around. For example, you send command controls, right? You're moving your player. So you might go right or left, or you're shooting a basketball or something. It's very little information, but it has to be reliable, because if you move right and the thing goes left, it's no good. And latency is critical for gaming, extremely critical. It has to be a few milliseconds, right? If you're playing with somebody else basketball, right? If you're going to block the shot and you take 10 extra milliseconds, maybe he already scored, so it's useless. So the point here is for you to see that applications vary a lot in terms of what they need from the system. So you have to design one system, just one system, that has to serve all these applications. So all these applications have to be happy. So you have to design a system that has a compromise. You have to trade off data rate, errors, latency, and you have to find a compromise. There's another category here on which we can classify applications, which is on whether they are bursty or continuous. So voice is continuous, and something like web browsing is very bursty, right? Usually you click on the mouse, you load the page, then you're going to spend maybe 2 minutes reading the page. So nothing's going to happen for 2 minutes or maybe 5. It depends. Could be a long time actually. And then you're going to click again and reload another page. So it's completely bursty. So some of the applications, many of them actually are bursty, but a few are continuous. And then I guess another final note here is that for some applications, security is also very important, right? So everything has to be encrypted. For example, if you want to be doing e-commerce, you're going to be using your credit card to buy something using your cell phone, you want to make sure that that's not picked up by somebody else. So supporting all these applications on just one wireless system poses a big challenge. And there are several reasons why this is particularly challenging. This is challenging for any communication system, but it's more challenging for a wireless system because a wireless system has some very unique features. It's an unreliable medium, and when we study propagation, we'll see why it's unreliable. But it is unreliable. It is pretty capacity limited, right? There's only so much stuff you can send over a wireless channel. And it's a broadcast medium. So what I mean by broadcast is that if I'm going to send something to somebody over there using radio, the signal is going to go in all directions, right? Even though I'm targeting somebody who's over there, some of the signal is going to be bouncing around and end up over there, right? So that's going to bother that person because that signal is not for him. Signal is not for other person. So this is going to be interference for this person. This person is receiving some signal from somebody else, but he's also receiving my unwanted signal as interference. So the wireless medium has this nature, it's broadcast. When you send something, it goes to everybody. And that's not the case when you have a wireline system, right? If you have a wire, I put a wire from here to there, the signal is contained in the wire, it's just going to go there. There's no way that signal is going to go end up somewhere else. When you use radio, that's not the case. It's a very special feature of wireless propagation. Then we have also the fact that traffic patterns and user locations are constantly changing. So everything is time variant, right? People move while they talk on the phone, and the channel changes. They corner, they get under a building, in a bridge, in a tunnel, and propagation changes very drastically, yet we want to try to maintain the communication. So it's quite challenging. And then as we saw, we have all these different applications with all these different QoS constraints that have to be made by the system. So the wrong of the wireless engineer is to overcome all these challenges. Let me show you a little bit using these charts why it's much harder to provide quality of service over a wireless system relative to a wireless network, right? So the details here are not very important. Don't pay attention to the names. But what this chart shows is, on the left, the horizontal axis is time. So this is 1970 up to today. And this is data rate that you can support over a system in bits per second. Actually, it's kilobits per second, right? That's kilobits per second. So there are two curves here, two lines. The top line corresponds to what historically has been the evolution of wireline systems, right? So these are systems that use wires, cables. You can see how they've gone better, right? From the 1975, they were at 10 kilobits per second. Today, they're at 100 megabits per second and growing. And so that's the top curve. The bottom curve is the same evolution, but for wireless systems. This is for local area networks, so computer networks using wireless, like Wi-Fi, for example, is up here. So the point here is to see the gap, right? There is a gap of about 2 orders of magnitude, a factor of 100, between the data rates that you can support when you have cables and the data rates that you can support when you do it over radio. Much harder, right? To provide this. So if you want to support the same application on this system as on this system, you have a much tougher job. This is the same chart except for wide area networks. So this is for, essentially this would be modems. So if you use dial-up modems, this is how modems have improved over the years from 2.4, even before started here, up to today, and then cable and DSL and all that stuff. And this is what cellular systems have been providing over the years. You can see again there is a significant gap. And not only, the gap is actually getting larger. Here we have maybe a factor of 1,000 today between what you can achieve using wireless and using a wireline system, right? So it's a very challenging task to design a wireless system that can compete with a wireline system, as you can see. So these quality of service needs of the different applications translate onto system requirements. And these are terms that we'll be using throughout the course. The first is capacity. So capacity measures the amount of bits per second that flow over the system reliably. So It relates to the rate that we saw at the beginning, data rate. So this is a term that we'll be using very frequently, so keep it in mind. Bits per second flowing reliably. Then latency, we talked about that. It's the delay in delivering the bits to the recipient. Coverage refers to the percentage of geographical locations with the minimum level of service, right? And you want to have a coverage as broad as possible. For example, remember that we said that for telephony, we want to have no more than 3% of blocking probability, right? That means that you need to have a minimum service on 97% of the locations, right? At least 97% of the locations. That's pretty tough because there are many locations that are hard to service. For example, elevators, basements, tunnels. Those are very hard. It's hard for the signal to get there. So it's very hard to achieve these 97, 98, 99% of coverage, but it is done. And then we have cost of service. We want to provide all of these quality of service at an affordable price so that the end customer can pay a reasonable price for the service, right? So cost of service relates to complexity also. Then there are some additional requirements on the user terminal. We have, very important, power consumption, right? It refers to battery life. You don't want to have a phone whose battery runs out in a few hours or even less, right? It's important that the battery is long-lasting. That means you want to use your power very carefully, right? So you want to use your power efficiently, so you want to consume as little power as possible. That's very important. One of the ways is complexity, right? The more processing you have in the phone, the more complexity, the more power is going to burn. So you want to keep that to a minimum, if you can. Then there is size and weight, right? You want to have portability. So the device should be as small as possible and not too heavy. There's a problem, of course, with the screen size. For example, some of the applications require, for example, video or pictures are hard to provide over a small screen. It's not very interesting to see a video over. I don't know if you guys have seen these new iPods that are video iPods. I haven't seen them yet, but it's not very enticing to me to see a movie on a screen this big, really. So there is a trade-off here really between size and weight and portability, and on the other hand, you want to have big screens. I think that some applications are just confined to laptops, for example. And finally, there's the cost of the device. The device cannot be too expensive. So all these requirements must be traded off and carefully balanced by the wireless engineer. It's a tough job. That's about all I had for applications, just to motivate you a little bit on this theme. Any questions at this point? Can I get a poll here? How many of you guys have a cell phone? All right, 99%. Good. All right, so we're going to go into the next topic. This is a very short topic, though. It's traffic theory. Kind of boring, but we'll get through it. It's just 2 slides, so bear with me. Okay, end-to-end communication requires a network of nodes that are connected to a switching center, right? That's how phone systems work. So if I was to place a phone call now to somebody in San Francisco, that call would go to a local switching office not far from here. From there, it would go to a bigger switching office somewhere in the New York area. And from there, it would go to a switching office somewhere in the Bay Area. From there to a local switching office near the customer that I'm trying to address, to find. And from there to the phone of the person that I'm calling. So the phone call will go through these different switches. And on each one, it'll be switched into the right direction. So in telephone systems, the way that works is that something called a circuit is established before the communication starts. So when you dial a number, in the few seconds that the phone is ringing, the circuit is established. So all these different offices that are between you and your target person that you're calling are going to reserve a circuit for this particular phone call. So they're going to assign some switches and some channels that will be reserved. And until the time you hang up, all this circuit is going to be reserved only for you. right? So the resources that form the circuit, bandwidth, switches, etc., are reserved for the entire duration of the connection, even when no communication takes place. So even if you choose not to talk for a while, until you hang up, that circuit is still reserved for you. That's how traditional switching has worked since the 19th century. This used to be done by hand. All switching is done by hand. So you would call an operator and he would manually switch for you. Now it's things electronic. But other than that, it hasn't changed much in over 100 years. This is a very appealing way of establishing communication if the resources are plentiful, right? Because even if you're not talking, you have the circuit reserved for you, you're not using it, it's being wasted. But if there's plenty of them, it doesn't matter, right? So it's appealing if there is plenty of resources. It is inefficient, however, if communication is bursty, right? If most of the time you're not going to talk, then most of the time the circuit will be idle and wasted. But it's nonetheless, it's still used today for telephony and also for video. But there is another way of switching, much more recent, which is called packet switching. So in packet switching, no circuit is established. So the data flow is fragmented into something called packets. And then these packets are routed over the network, possibly to different paths, right? That's how the internet works. So when you send an email to somebody else, this email is fragmented into packets. The packets can have between a few hundred bits up to a few thousand bits. And then these packets are sent one at a time to the internet. They go through different switching centers, and they get to the destination. Then they go through different paths. For example, if a particular path gets congested, the packets that come later are going to go through different paths. So there is optimized routing. And then they get to the receiver, and often they get there out of sequence. For example, they get there in the wrong order. Then something called the TPC protocol is going to put them back in sequence, reorder them, reassemble them into the original email, and then give that back to you. So in a packet switch network, when communication stops, no packets are sent. And so no resources are wasted, right? So we're only using the network when we're actually sending a packet. And in fact, just to keep the notation clear, in packet switching, the switches are not the term switches, they're terms routers. They're termed routers. I don't know why, but they're called routers. This form of switching was conceived in the 1960s, and when computers became available. It is very appealing if resources are limited because it doesn't waste any resources, right? In other words, nothing is ever idle. Everything is always used. And the downside is that it requires more processing power. You have to have all these switches, flipping packets back and forth and routing them in the right way. It takes a little more work, but it's much more efficient. It is universally used in data and computer networks. And what we're seeing today, interestingly, it's a progressive migration of all systems, even telephony, to packet switching. So in a few years, there will be no more circuit switching, I'm pretty sure. Everything will be packetized. So even telephony now is moving to packet switching. Any of you has used Skype or uses Skype to do internet calling? Probably you. I use Skype a lot, right? So Skype is, I think there are other systems that do internet telephony. Right, so that's how it works. So Skype uses packet switching. So it takes your voice, it breaks it up into little packets, sends them out. So it doesn't establish the circuit. That's why it's so cheap. And the quality used to be pretty bad, but it's been getting better, I think. So the problem with packet switching sometimes is the delays. So one of the packets won't get delayed, for example. That's what happened. And so you'll be missing packets here and there. But they're getting better, and a day will come where all telephone systems will be replaced and everything will be done through the internet. And I think that day is coming, not in the not too distant future. That's about all I want to say about traffic theory. I think this is enough for the course. mostly I want you guys to have the notion of what a circuit is and what a packet is, and that you understand that some systems used to be circuit switched, and now they're moving into being packet switched. And pretty soon everything will be packet switched. That's about it. Questions on this topic? Anybody? Nothing? All right, let's move on. Okay, let's go through the historical tour, and then we'll take the break. So, I guess one could argue that wireless communication is as old as civilization, right? If we think about smoke signals, flashing mirrors, pigeons, etc. Pretty old stuff. Now, modern wireless communications, as we understand them today, can be traced back to the 19th century. In my mind, the starting point for this is the invention of the telegraph, which took place in 1830 by this gentleman that we have here. This is a portrait of himself, and this is a copy of his patent. This is the original patent of the telegraph. As you can see, it's handwritten, pretty neat. Granted in 1840. I'm sorry. So he invented this way of communicating over a cable, where you use short and long symbols to form different words and letters and numbers and whatnot. And that was pretty much where modern communication started. Then the next big event was the invention of the telephone, which took place in 1876. And this is kind of a fun story because it was invented by two gentlemen independently and at the same time. So on the left we have Alexander Graham Bell, and on the right we have another fellow much less known called Elisha Gray. So these two gentlemen filed for patents on a telephone the same day, within 2 hours of each other. Amazing. So a very long litigation ensued. It took for about 2 years until things were sorted out. And at the end, Graham Bell prevailed. So he was granted the patent for the telephone, and Elisha Gray was not granted his patent. So he was pretty unlucky, I guess. So that was in 1876, and Graham Bell actually is the fellow after which the place where I work is named, Bell Laboratories. It's named after Graham Bell. The next big event came, actually had already happened, which was the formulation of the four Maxwell laws in the 1860s. So James Maxwell formulated his four laws that regulate the propagation of electromagnetic waves. He was a theoretician though, so he never proved anything. It was somebody else, Hertz, who demonstrated the propagation of radio waves in 1887. So Maxwell was more the theoretician and Hertz was more the practitioner. The ultimate practitioner, though, was this other gentleman, Marconi, who invented the radio in the 1880s. So this is Marconi himself. He was of Italian origin. He was a very smart businessman, besides an inventor. Also here there is some dispute as to who really invented the radio. There are people that contend that it was either Popov or Nikola Tesla. And there is quite a lot of evidence showing that those guys had invented radio before Marconi did. But he's the one that got the patent, and he's the one that went down in history. And actually he became a businessman using radio for propagation, for communication with offshore ships, for example. And well into the 19th century, in fact, the Titanic used his radio to send, one of his radios to send an SOS when he was sinking. So we're at the end of the 19th century, radio has been invented, and people are starting to think about using it for communication. So there was this guy at AT&T, John Carty, who wrote in some old document, we could use a system of telephony without wires. Seems an interesting possibility. Like he wrote, the ether will transmit speech. So he was probably the first to envision using radio for communication. And initially, the only thing they used was telegraphy. So they took the telegraph of Morse, which used to work on a wire, and they put it on a radio. So if they had a radio, they were sending just these beeps, long and short, to communicate. That's how the Titanic was sending the SOS, using Morse code over a radio. For several years, it was thought there was no way to transmit voice over radio because of its low frequency. It's very hard to communicate at very low frequencies, which is the frequency of the voice. So people thought it was impossible, that all you could do was telegraphy. And then the solution came, of course, using something called modulation. And what that does for you is it translates the signal to a higher frequency. That's the idea of modulation. And using amplitude modulation, the first transmission of voice and music took place around 1906, I believe. The FM, that is the one used mostly today, frequency modulation, was not invented until 1935, here in New York City, actually. So, but we're still in 1906, and AM was used. Then in the 1920s, AT&T started to supply mobile communication equipment for the Detroit first, and then the New York City police departments for cars dispatch. And here you can see one of the early prototypes. So this is one of the earliest cell phones in history, probably. So you can see this is the antenna here. This big square is the antenna. And this huge box, that's the phone. It was an amplitude modulated phone, extremely simple. So that takes us to World War II, where there were a lot of advances because of the war, of course. So sophisticated equipment were built by the military. So there was a big leap forward. And that translated also into the civil arena. So the first public wireless telephony systems were launched in 25 US cities in 1946, just after the war. And these were what we could call mamas and papas systems. So every metropolitan area had just one transmitter. So for example, New Jersey, right? You take New Jersey, you pick you pick a mountain that's in a central location. You put a big tower on the top of this mountain to serve the whole of New Jersey with strong power, big amplifier. And that's it, that's the system. So anybody in New Jersey talks to that one tower. And so the capacity is extremely low. In fact, what this says, here you go. 30 years after initial deployment, so that puts us in the 1970s. The New York system could only handle 543 simultaneous users, right? That's probably how many users are using cell phones in Colombia today at one moment in time. So in New York City today, there's tens of thousands of users at any point in time. So these systems were extremely primitive. The key development that allowed systems to move forward and become what we have today was the invention of the cellular concept. So we'll talk about this after the break. But the idea here is that instead of having just one transmitter in this mountain covering this whole area, you can put many of them, right? You can put one every few miles. And exploit the fact that the signal falls off with distance. So even though these multiple transmitters are going to interfere with each other, if they're sufficiently far away, the interference is going to be acceptable. So the signal is going to decay over distance. And by the time it reaches another tower, with which is going to interfere, it's going to be sufficiently weak to be acceptable. So that's the key idea here, and we'll spend a lot more time on that throughout the course. But the point is to have different transmitters that operate at the same frequency at the same time in different geographical locations, not too far from each other. That's the idea. So each transmitter essentially creates its own cell of influence, and hence that's why it's called a cell phone, and that's why it's called a cell system. So this is a picture of 1946 paper where this idea was first proposed. It was an internal paper published at AT&T Bell Labs at the time. And it's hard to see, but essentially this is New Jersey, and this is Long Island, and here's Manhattan. You can identify it. And this guy had the idea, right? He said, okay, I'm going to have all these circles. Each one is a cell. Each one will have a transmitter. And people thought he was crazy at the beginning because they thought, well, what happens when people move around, right? If I'm here and I'm driving, I get out of this circle and I get into another circle, what's going to happen to me? All this was solved eventually, but it was pretty revolutionary idea at the time. So we're in the 1960s. After this idea has matured, so this was 1946, that paper. It took about 20 years for this idea to be accepted, matured, developed. And out of that came the first generation of systems. There were analog systems, just FM radios pretty much, like today. So the main two systems were in the US, something called AMPS, which is still exists today. So there are still people using it in the US. AMPS stands for Advanced Mobile Phone System. And in Europe, they had something called NMT, which stands for Northern Mobile Telephone. It was mostly Northern Europe, Sweden, Norway, Finland. And the big players in the US developing these AMP system were AT&T, Bell Labs, and Motorola. It's like in a close race. So the first call was made by Martin Cooper, the head of Motorola in 1973, who called his rival, the head of AT&T, Bell Labs, Joe Engel. And the phone he used weighted 1 kilo and cost $4,000 at the time. It's $4,000 in 1973. You can imagine how much that would be today. Very expensive. But it worked, and the first commercial deployment took place in Chicago by AT&T in 1983. Then something kind of surprising happened in the 1980s, which is that AT&T lost interest. It commissioned a study from a well-known consulting firm, which John Gowen named. And this firm predicted that at most there would be 1 million subscribers in the world, cell phone subscribers, by the year 2000. Now, the actual figure when we got to 2000 was over 1 billion. So these guys were short by a factor of 1,000, something just ridiculous. So AT&T followed the advice of this consulting company and abandoned wireless and just completely focused on fiber optics, which also proved to be a good business, but they abandoned wireless. And so the US remained, the US, which had been ahead, actually fell behind. So while this was happening in the 80s, the Europeans were busy developing a new system, digital, called GSM, which stands for Global System for Mobile Communications. And this system would end up ruining the world. The US was kind of sleeping it. The first deployments took place in the early 90s, and today this is by far the most popular standard all over the world. Then the US followed suit with its own system, its own digital system called CDMA, a few years later, at the end of the 1990s. But GSM remains dominant to this date, and in fact it has made also strong inroads in the US, where it's now also a big player. So we can do a show of hands here. Which of you are serviced by Verizon or Sprint? Right, so those are CDMA phones. And which of you use T-Mobile or Singular? Right, those are GSM phones, right? So you guys, GSM phones, you can travel overseas pretty much anywhere you want, and your phone's going to work. Now, it's going to be expensive, but you're going to roam. CDMA phones can only roam in a few places, mostly Japan, South Korea, and a bit of South America. But if you don't travel too far, that's all right. So there was an exponential growth in the 90s that ignited a big revolution and prompted the development of yet another generation of systems called the third generation. So in Europe, that's called UMTS, which stands for Universal Mobile Telephone System. And in the US, it's called CDMA 2000, which continues the other CDMA. These systems are now being rolled out. They're just starting. And they're designed to handle not only voice and messaging, but also high-speed data. So we can identify some key transitions. In the transition from first generation to second generation, we went from analog systems that use just FM radio to digital systems that actually send bits. That was a big change. So much more reliable. You can also do messaging and a little bit of data. Then going from 2G to 3G, which is what's happening today, we're adding packet switching and a lot of data, right? So Verizon has a pretty good service now, for example. You can do a lot of things. You can definitely send pictures. You can send multimedia messages. Also GSM, by the way. You can send multimedia messages, which are picture messages. You can probably send video. You can view TV now, or if you cannot, you'll soon be able to watch TV on your cell phone. So the big thing is packet switching and data. That's a big change in the third generation. What's after 3G? Nobody knows. For sure, it'll be all packet switched. There's a bit of buzz now about fourth generation. Typically, these generations take about 10 years. So the next generation should not come until 2015 or something like that. So it's still early. We'll have to see what happens with the third generation and what kind of applications people come up with. I guess I have a curiosity note here, which is that the terms wireless and radio have been in and out of fashion over the years. So right now, wireless is in and radio is out. But it wasn't always like that. In the 80s, it was radio was in and wireless was out. So if this course had been taught 20 years ago, it would be radio communications, so the wireless communications. And maybe it'll change again. I don't quite know why. So let's go over this, and then we'll stop. Some fun facts. There are about 2 billion subscribers worldwide today. That's about 30%, close to 1/3 of the population. Pretty impressive, eh? Growing at about 150 million per year. And so you get an idea for these numbers, right? How many computers there are in the world? There are about 500 million PCs and 100 million laptops. So there are, let's see, there are 4 cell phones for every computer. And there are 20 cell phones for every laptop. I think it's extremely impressive because this has happened in just a decade. The number of wireless subscribers today triples the number of landline networks. So until in the 1990s, there were more landline phones than wireless phones. They became equal in the year 2000, and in just 5 years, wireless has tripled the number of subscribers. So many more people have now a cell phone that they don't even have a fixed phone. They only have a cell phone. And last year, 726 million cell phones were sold. Of course, many of them are replacement and upgrades, so that doesn't mean that these are all new customers. So 150 are new. The other 600 are just changing their phone. By countries, the US has about 180 million, which is roughly 60% of the population. That's pretty low penetration, actually. The US has a pretty low penetration. In comparison, Western Europe and Northern Europe and Korea and Japan approach or even exceed 100% penetration. Today I saw that Luxembourg, which is a little country next to Belgium in France, has a penetration of 160%. So it is just mind-boggling. So there's almost 2 phones per person. So that means that most people have 2 phones, or at least 2 phone numbers. Really, really surprising. China has pretty low penetration, but because it's such a huge country, the number of phones in absolute terms is huge. It's twice as many as in the US. So it's a market that's growing very rapidly. And finally, a breakdown by standards. So of these 2 billion phones that we saw are in the world, about 1.6 billion are GSM. So you can see it's a massive domination. About 300 million are CDMA phones, and those are mostly confined to the US, South Korea, Japan, and a bit of South America. There are about 50 million, I think by now it's about 100 million, that are third generation, so the UMTS or CDMA 2000. And the rest belong to local standards, some analog remnants, especially in the US, there's still a lot of amps and the such. But mostly it's GSM and some CDMA. Other success stories, cordless phones. People often forget about them, but they've had spectacular success in the 1970s. I'm sure that most of you have one at home, right? I have one. Just an extension to your phone, but it's very convenient. And it's also a wireless system, no denying. Wireless guns. They started in the 1980s. And for many years, they were highly unpopular. Some companies were bankrupt trying to sell this stuff. Nobody was buying it. And that was because there was no web yet. When web browsing came and email in the 90s, the usage exploded. And in recent years, it's all the rage, right? 802.11, that's the standard name for Wi-Fi is IEEE 802.11. I'll cover that a little later. And I'm sure many of you use your laptop for web browsing, right? So that's what you're using. And some fingers. There was much hype in the late 90s that led to some fingers around 2000. The biggest one by far was the failure of the satellite systems. So there were these two systems, one called Iridium, one called Globalstar, which were aiming at providing ubiquitous coverage all over the world using a network of low Earth orbit satellites. They both went bankrupt. And I'll have some slides later because it's very interesting to see why this happened, what was wrong with the design. Of course, in hindsight, everything is easy, but it was a very ambitious project, and it was just too expensive. They couldn't compete with cell phones. The terminals also were too big, heavy, and ran out of battery very quickly. There was another failure that most people don't know about, which is a company called Metricom, and these guys were just ahead of the time. These guys were offering something like Wi-Fi in the early 1990s. So they started service in the Bay Area. So when I was a graduate student, I used to use their service. It was very popular with the graduate students. So you bought a little modem card, you put it on your computer, and you could browse the web and do email. It was not very fast. It was maybe doing 20 or 30 kilobits per second. But in the 1990s, there was nothing like that. So on campus, it was extremely popular. Then they offered service also in New York City. And they did okay for a while, but in the end, they couldn't get enough customers. It was mostly young people that were signing on in campuses, but they couldn't get massive support from the population, and they went under. I think that today they will be successful, but oh well. All right, guys, I think this is a good time to break. So we'll take a break. It's 5:20, so 15 minutes, and we'll pick it up. I want to let you go home early today, so let's get to it. Okay, so we saw this. Okay, so we'll talk very quickly about spectrum reclamation now. You'll see why this is important. Okay, spectrum. Spectrum is bandwidth. The allocation of spectrum for commercial usage is controlled in the US by something called the FCC, which you may see in the press sometimes in the newspapers and stuff. That stands for Federal Communications Commission, and it's a commission with five commissioners right now because the Republicans are in power. There's 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, but that changes. These are very powerful men. Something similar in Europe called Erksm, which stands for European, I think it's Technical Standards Institute. And then worldwide, there's something called the ITU, which stands for International Telecommunications Union. You don't have to remember all these, don't worry about it. So the ITU has a branch called ITUR that deals with spectrum allocation. And the way this works is as follows. The FCC essentially auctions licenses to use spectral blocks for given applications, right? For example, in the 1990s, there was a big auction around 95, 96, where they auctioned 150 megahertz of bandwidth in blocks of 5, 10, or 20 megahertz. So if you're a company like Verizon, for example, or Sprint, you can make a bid for some of the spectrum. And if you win the bid, then that spectrum becomes yours. So you get a license to use that spectrum. And this gives you exclusivity, right? So if you have a license, then you're the sole user for that piece of bandwidth. Nobody else can use it. So that's a very nice thing, but it's expensive. Especially in Europe, it's been very expensive, more than in the US. The 3G auctions in Europe in the 90s raised billions of dollars, some outrageous amount of money. So since the bandwidth that you get through licenses is so expensive, this puts a very big emphasis on something called spectrum efficiency, which is a metric that quantifies how well you use the bandwidth, essentially how many bits per second you send over a given amount of bandwidth. So when spectrum is expensive, this puts a premium on using it well, and this spectrum efficiency quantifies how well you use the spectrum. Now, there is another class of spectrum that is unlicensed. And so here you don't have to get a license. You can just go ahead and use the spectrum. And all you have to do is follow some etiquette rules, which essentially boil down to power levels. So an example of that is Wi-Fi, right? When you use Wi-Fi on your laptop, that uses unlicensed spectrum. So no license is required for that. All you have to do is keep your power below some minimum level. I think it's 1 megahertz. There's several rules. And as long as you do that, you're okay. You're in the law. Now, what happens in the unlicensed bands is that because anybody can use them, they get very congested. And that's becoming a big problem now for Wi-Fi, actually. You can have, you have your Wi-Fi at home to have your laptop wirelessly, and then your neighbors, your 5 neighbors also have their Wi-Fi systems, and they kill each other with interference. This is becoming a big problem as Wi-Fi gets to be very popular. So this is traditionally how spectrum has been allocated. There is licensed, you pay for it, it's only yours. There is unlicensed, anybody can use it, just be careful, follow the rules. There's a new trend emerging now, which is to allow for something called underlay systems. So the idea here is that there is still a license, so there is a primary owner of the spectrum, which has the license, and then there are other users, secondary users, which can also use the bandwidth without the license, but restricted to causing minimal interference onto the licensed user, right? For example, there is something called ultra-wideband, and I'll talk about that in a few slides. So let's leave it at this for now. Just remember this. Now, you may wonder why is this so important, right? Why do we have to worry so much about licenses? Isn't there plenty of spectrum? Well, there is plenty of spectrum, but there isn't. because there is an infinite amount of spectrum, but there is a limited amount of high quality spectrum. That's the problem. There is just a few gigahertz of bandwidth that are really usable, and that's why it's so expensive. So most of the systems, at least the terrestrial systems, so I'm excluding satellite systems here when I say terrestrial, most of the terrestrial systems reside in spectrum that goes between a few hundred megahertz and something on the order of 10 gigahertz. So below a few hundred megahertz, the problem is the antennas. The antennas become too large. Essentially, the size of the antenna relates directly to the wavelength of the signal. So the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength, and the longer the wavelength, the bigger the antenna. So when you go too low in frequency, the antenna becomes too big. And you saw, right? Remember this guy here? He uses a pretty low frequency. As you can see, the antenna is huge. So you're going to go too low. Now, you're going to go too high either, because propagation becomes very hard. Essentially, propagation becomes very directive at high frequencies. So there's no way you could reach somebody who's behind the building, for example, or behind the hill. You would have to have line of sight to the phone to service it. And that's a big problem. Most of the time you're indoors. Like, imagine if I'm here now, I want to use my phone, right? I have no line of sight to any base station. But I can use it because the frequency is pretty low. If I was to go above 10 gigahertz, it wouldn't work. Everything is directed. Not only that, there's problems with the rain also. When it rains, there is a very strong attenuation because of the rain or snow. So frequencies above 10 gigahertz become very hard in terms of propagation. So essentially, we're confined to using this interval between a few hundred megahertz and something about 10 gigahertz. That's why it's so expensive. Now, satellite systems operate above 10 gig, sometimes around 16 gig. And they don't have a problem with the directivity because usually at least if you're outside, the satellite is always up on the horizon, on the sky, so you always have a good line of sight to it. So that's not a big impediment. And in fact, they prefer to use high frequencies because they have to go through the ionosphere, which is easier at high frequencies. But that's beyond us, so let's not worry about it. Let me just go over the main license bands in the US. So we have two bands, actually more than two now. Used to be two bands. We have the 900 megahertz band, goes from 806 to 902. That's where the analog systems used to work for the generation, and also some of the second generation systems work there. So if you have a Verizon phone, it could be working there. Then there's a second band, which is at 2 gigahertz. It's 1.85 to 1.99, just under 2 gigahertz. This is used also for second generation digital phones. So GSM phones are here. So if you have those of you that have T-Mobile or similar are in this band. Then the new 3G phones are coming in another band, which is just underneath that one, which is around 1.7 to 1.85 gigahertz. And finally, there is also a new band, although it's not being used yet, at 2.5 gigahertz. That's mainly what's being used in the US for licensed cellular systems. Then for unlicensed, we have cordless phones. They work at 900 megahertz, most of them. And then we have wireless LANs, like Wi-Fi. They work at 2.4, between 2.4 and 2.48 gigahertz. And also Bluetooth, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. There's another band at 5 gigahertz for wireless LANs. So if you have, there's multiple classes of Wi-Fi. If you have 802.11b or G, you're at 2.4. If you have A, you're at 5 gigahertz. So on to standards. Why are standards needed? Well, the main reason that we need standards is because we want to have a marketplace where multiple companies can provide different components, right? So if there was only one company building everything, there would be no need for standards. But we want to have a market where we can have, for example, Motorola making equipment, and then Erksm making equipment, and Nokia, and Lucent ourselves, and all these other companies. And the equipment of these companies has to be able to communicate, right? For example, you can have a phone built by Samsung, and you can have a Verizon service with the Samsung phone. The equipment is built by my company, by Erksm. The phone is Samsung, yet they communicate perfectly well because they follow a standard. So that's the wrong of the standard. It defines a set of rules that the system has to follow so that all these different components from different companies can fit together. Now, these standards are approved in the US by something called the TIA, which means Telecommunication Industry Association. And within the TIA, there's a branch called the CTIA, which is the Cellular Telecommunications Industry Association. And then worldwide, there is something called the ITU-T, so it's another branch of this ITU. So these guys sort of stamp the standards and declare them good, but they don't develop them. The standards are developed by organizations such as IEEE in the US, that's the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, Erksm in Europe, and something called RIP in Japan. Also, they're developed by some industrial consortia, such as 3GPP and 3GPP2. So these guys develop the standards, and then these CTIA stamps it as good and declares it, gives it a name, etc. So essentially, different companies get together in this standard consortia, and they try to push their technology, right? So companies patent their inventions, and then try to have them adopted so that they can get licenses they can license the inventions to all the other companies. So that's one of the reasons that the patent office is flooded with applications and sort of overwhelmed. There is a nice summary of the standards in the Appendix D, I think it is. And you don't need to memorize any of this stuff. This is mostly for your interest if you have it. So yeah, it is a D, and it has a summary of standards, to me, and then also by good reference. But you don't need to memorize all this stuff. I think that it's useful that you have a notion of whether your phone is GSM or CDMA, but that's about it. So let's get into the serious part of the lecture today. We'll talk about the cellular concept and the key idea in the cellular concept, which is the frequency reuse. So this is how cellular systems work, right? We take a geographic region and we divide it into, and I have a picture, I think, here. All right, here we are. So we take a region, we divide it into cells. And here, I'm idealizing it. I'm making all the cells the same shape, the same size. They're all hexagonal and perfect. In practice, cells have less regular shapes because of topology, right? If there is a hill over here, it's going to change the shape of the cells. Sometimes you cannot put these towers where you want to put them because there is a building or because it falls in the middle of the campus or something. So you put them where you can. But this is a useful idealization. You have hexagonal cells adjacent. Each cell is served by something called the base station, which I'm showing here using this tower, right? It is sometimes physically a tower, but it doesn't have to be. It could be just something on the roof of a building, for example. So how large are these cells? Well, it depends. In an urban area like New York, typically it'll be less than a mile, right? Maybe half a mile even. In suburban areas, say you go to New Jersey, it can be a few miles. And in rural areas, it can be even 10 or 20 miles. So it depends on the density. Now, notice that the serving base is never farther away than one cell size, right? So if you're moving out of the cell, then you're going to be entering another cell. So at the most, you're going to be one cell size away from your base station. So that means that you never have to communicate very far, right? You never have to send a signal to a very distant location. At most, 1 mile, a few miles. This is very different from the old system. Remember I told you about these mamas and papas systems where you have just one base station for a whole metropolitan area. That could be 50 miles away. So you need a lot of power. Here you don't. Now the key is that all these cells, on these base stations, reuse bandwidth at functionally separating locations. And here I'm using a corner code to show that. So the cells that are blue are using the same frequencies, the same channels, the same bandwidth. So the signals that are sent out from a blue tower are going to be interfering with the signals from another blue tower. In fact, all the blue towers are going to interfere. So here we have blue, green, and yellow. We have 3 groups of frequencies. And the ones on different colors exhibit no interference. So they don't see each other. But the ones on the same color, they do. Then we have that the base stations are connected by a wireline network. So here I'm using this cloud to represent the network. So each of them, and I'm only using 3 here, but each of them is connected through cables to a network. All right? Now, I've talked about the cell sizes. I guess I can make one more point, which is that the smaller the cell sizes, the higher the capacity of the system. That's why in very dense areas, we want to make them small. In strong areas, we want to make them big. Also, small cell sizes reduce the power consumption, right? Because, as I said, the distance you have to travel in terms of propagation is just the size of the cell. So the smaller the cell, the longer is the distance, so the longer is the power. And on the flip side, smaller cells mean that there's many more of them, right? You want to cover New York City with cells. If you make them smaller, you need more cells. That means you need more network, you need more cables going around connecting these base stations. That's the trade-off. Complexity versus higher capacity and less power consumption. So this is a picture of an actual base station. Here on the left, this is a Lucent base station, third generation. You can see, well, you don't have a scale reference, but it's essentially the file of the size of a cabinet. So it's something like this, like a file cabinet type of thing. It has multiple racks with all the boards, filters, amplifiers, etc. And here we have an actual cell tower, and this is in New Jersey, somewhere in New Jersey. So you can see the tower. These all the equipment is going to be somewhere near the base, probably in this little house here, it's covered for from the weather and stuff. Then the cables run up, and all the antennas are on the top. So if you drive around, you've probably seen many of these. And in New York City, they tend to be on top of buildings rather than on standalone towers. They tend to be on rooftops. All right, that's the key idea in cellular. Now this idea by subdividing cell into something called, and let me take you through this picture. So first, let me say, the way you create sectors is using directional antennas. So here is a typical structure. You have 3 antennas pointing in different directions, and each of them is going to be directional. So it's only going to illuminate a certain angle, right? So this guy is going to be sending signals this way and receiving only this way. This guy this other way, and so forth. They're going to cover the whole space, but split in 3 parts, right? So those are the 3 sectors. So each of the cells here, you can see, has 3 sectors of the same size. So now what you do is, besides having, in addition to having the colors, which says, blue use the same channels, but then orange use different channels, and then green use different channels, we have yet another subdivision, which is per sector, right? So we have sectors 1, 2, and 3 on each of the cells. So now, sector 1 of blue is going to interfere only with sector 1 of other blue, right? Sector 2 of blue, only with sector 2 of blue, and so on and so forth, right? Sector 1 of green interferes only with sector 1 of green. This reduces the interference significantly, right? You have to think, for example, this base station, let's focus on this sector. Let's focus on sector 1 of blue, right? This antenna is illuminating this sector. in this direction, right? So it doesn't cause any interference to this other sector blue here. It does only to the sector blue up here and also on the sides. So we've reduced, in fact, by a third, because there are 3 sectors. If you work it out, what happens at the end is that you reduce by 3 the amount of sectors that you interfere with. So essentially, each sector is functionally equivalent to a cell, except that the 3 sectors are collocated. So we could, instead of using 1, 2, and 3, we could use newcomers, right? We could use dark blue, light blue, and medium blue, and then dark yellow, dark green, light green, and medium green. And each one would interfere only with the same tone of the same color. Is that clear? Yes.
The sectors, they are working on the same frequency or the frequency of the different?
Yes. Each sector has a set of frequencies. And the other sectors in the same cell have different frequencies, right? And also the cells with different colors have different frequencies. So as I was saying, sector 1 of a blue cell uses the same channels as any other sector 1 of a blue cell. Everybody else has different channels. And there is only interference between the same channels. Does that help? Anybody else? All right. So in a cellular system, we have to partition resources. Essentially, we have to partition bandwidth or channels, frequencies. So there is 3 levels at which we do this partition. And these are terms that we'll be using in the course, so get familiar with them. The first is duplexing. We use the term downlink to indicate communication between a base and a terminal, right? So downlink would be this. This base talking to a cell phone over here. So the downlink is the base talking to the cell phone. Then the uplink is the cell phone talking to the base. And since we're interested in a 2-way communication, we always need to have a downlink and an uplink. Sometimes these are called also forward and reverse. So the downlink is called sometimes forward, and there's a cell phone ringing. And the reverse, and the uplink is called reverse link. Essentially, there is 2 ways to do this separation. So we can do it using different frequencies. So we're going to have the base station talk to the cell phone on one frequency, on one channel, and then the phone talking back to the base station on a different channel, different frequency. That's one way. It's called frequency duplexing. The other way is time duplexing. We can have the cell phone and the base station alternate in time. We're going to have them. The base talks for a little while, then it stops, and then the phone talks for a little while, and they alternate. And this is done typically. This is called time duplexing, and typically this alternation takes a few milliseconds, right? So we'll have something like this. We'll have down, and then we'll have up, and then down. This will be time, and this will be some few milliseconds. This is also done sometimes. So, for example, cordless phones work this way, all of them. So they use the same frequency. So that's duplexing, how we separate communication from base to terminal and communication back from terminal to base. Then we have something called multiple access. Think that when you have in general, when you have a cell, right? Let's go to the general one. Here I've only drawn one user per cell. In general, we're going to have multiple users talking to the same base, right? We're going to have in a typical second generation system, you can have the order of 50 users at each point in time talking to a single base station, possibly up to 50 users. So communication from these 50 users has to be separated also, so we don't mix them up. That's called multiple access, right? So that's how we separate the links to the different users that are in the same cell. In fact, when we have sectorization, which is most of the time, what I said refers to each sector, right? So each sector will have a number of users. We have to separate communication between users in the same sector. That's multiple access. And finally, we have something called interference management. Relates to how we use. So in this case, interference management is going to tell us how many colors we need. So here I've chosen to use 3 colors. So 3 groups of channels: blue, orange, and green. But why 3, right? Is that enough? Should I use 5? Should I use 2? Here in the sectors, why 3 sectors per sector? Should I use more sectors, fewer sectors? Why 3? That's the art of managing interference. So there's an optimum choice for all these reuse factors, and we'll study that later in the course in quite a lot of detail. That's all I want to say about this at this point. But keep this in mind because we'll be using them: duplexing, multiple access, and interference. Questions here? All right. So this is cell phone. We have these cells, right? For example, take San Francisco. We have a bunch of base stations, which it cells. Each one has a number of users. And as I told you before, all these bases are connected to a network. So physically, they're connected to something called an MTSO or an MSC. Both names are used. That stands for Mobile Telephone Switching Office, and MSC stands for Mobile Switching Center. Same thing, right? So all the bases, so this guy can control easily a few hundred of these base stations, one of these switches, right? Any switch is connected to 2 places. In the old system, there was only this. It's connected only to here. That means public switch telephone system, telephone network. So that's the phone system. That's the regular phone network that we use even when we don't use a cell phone on a landline phone, right? That's the telephone network. So these days, in 3G systems, we also have internet. So the switch is also connected to the internet. How things work when you make a phone call is as follows. So suppose you're one of these guys, make a phone call and you want to call a friend who is in New York. Place your call, so the signal goes to the base station that's serving you at that time. Signal goes to the switch. And in the switch, it's routed to the, if it's a phone call, it's routed to the PSTN. And here it is circuit switched all the way. Now, if you call in a fixed phone, that's it. It's circuit switched to the phone, and you're done, right? If you're calling another cell phone, the call is going to end up being routed to another switching office. For example, you call a friend in New York. The call is going to end up in a switching office in New York, from which it's going to go to the base station to which this user is connected. That's about it. A few points I want to make here. First, mobility, right? I told you before that one of the challenges when this idea of the cells was proposed, people thought it wouldn't work because of mobility, right? What happens if you're here and then you drive out and you wander into this other area, right? What's going to happen? At some point, this base is going to be very far. You're going to be close to this other base. So what happens is that something called a handoff takes place. So a handoff means that this base is giving up control of you, and this other base is taking over. And this happens, so the 2 bases are going to negotiate through the switch. And when they detect that the signal of this base is getting weak, and this one is getting stronger, at some point you'll be handed off. And in the old systems, in the analog systems, you used to actually hear a click when it switched. You guys are probably too young, but you could hear the click when it was handing you off. So the call was briefly interrupted and then picked up by the other base. Now in the digital systems, you don't notice anything, but
nonetheless the handoff takes place. And if you're driving on the highway, for example, and you make a pretty long phone call, say 10 minutes, you may have 2 or 3 handoffs during that time. Then the other point I want to make is about these young guys here, these 2 registers. This is called home location register, and this is called visitors location register. So these allow you to roam around the system. For example, say you are in New York, right? You live here, study at Columbia, and you want to go to visit a friend in San Francisco for the weekend. So Friday night, you go to the airport, you close your phone, get in a plane, then you arrive to San Francisco, and then you start your phone. The phone is going to be pretty lost at the beginning, but eventually it's going to pick up a base station in San Francisco. It's going to identify itself. Then the signal will go to the switch, and the switch will identify that this user is a visitor, right? It doesn't belong in that area. It's from somewhere else. So what it'll do is it'll write its information on this register, the visitors register, and then it's going to report back to its serving system in New York about its whereabouts. So it's going to call New York and say, hey, this guy just appeared here. He's visiting us. So in the home location register in New York, they write down that this guy is in San Francisco. Okay? Now, when somebody calls you on the weekend, they don't know your way. They call you, they tell you in New York. The call is going to go to New York, to the switch in New York. Then look you up in the register, and they'll say, oh, this guy is reported to be in San Francisco. They're going to route the call to the switch in San Francisco. These guys will look you up in this visiting location register, and they route the call to the cell where you are at that point in time. So as long as your phone is on, the system will always know where you are. Okay? If you turn it off, it won't. But as long as the phone is on, they'll report back, and they'll always be able to find you. Notice, though, that when somebody calls you, even if you are in San Francisco, the call first goes to New York, always. Goes to New York, and is then routed to your actual location. Some new trends that are appearing in wireless systems. Well, notice here that this type of system today, because of this, requires 2 completely different networks. We have this PSTN, which is used for voice, phone calls, and it's circuit switched. And then we have the internet, which is used for data and everything else, and which is packet switched. So this is very expensive to maintain 2 networks for just one system. So the trend is to go just network. So even though with 2 networks you have a higher quality of service, because you can provide circuit switching for voice and packet switching for data, increasingly the trend that is to go to one network where everything is packetized. So in fact, this is happening already in wireline. In wireline, it's not quite yet, but it will happen. So in wireline, now there's something called voice over IP. You may have seen this term before, VoIP. That's what Skype does, for example. Skype is VoIP. And what they do is they packetize voice and send it over the internet. And that's where things are going. So this trend is going to reach wireless systems at some point. The reason it hasn't yet is because of latency. So in wireless, we have a big problem with latency. Packets tend to be delayed quite a lot, and this really kills the quality. But eventually, we'll get this under control, and this structure will change. So this will disappear from here. Doesn't mean it will disappear completely. But from wireless systems, then go through the internet all the way, and the switches are going to disappear too. So essentially, you just put the idea, the vision really is to put the base station straight into the internet in a few years. All right, so the last topic for today is this system classification. So I want to tell you a bit, just very briefly, about the 8 types of systems. First, and most important, of course, cellular systems. Second, paging. third fixed wireless, fourth satellite, then cordless LANs, Bluetooth and ultra wideband, and put them together, and then ad hoc networks. And I've grouped these 8 classes of systems in 2 different ways. Here on the left, according to whether they're licensed or unlicensed. So the top 4 are licensed, and the bottom 4 are unlicensed. And then on the right, I've grouped them depending on whether they use traditional cellular architectures, which means infrastructure, which means base stations, or on whether they are peer-to-peer. And I'll tell you what that is in a second. So most of the course is going to be focused on cellular systems and wireless LANs. But many of the themes that we'll cover are also relevant to the other classes of systems. So a lot of it is really reusable. Okay, very quickly. Cellular systems, just some notions. I think I've told you some of these before already. Cell sizes. Urban environments, roughly 1 kilometer, and the tendency is to diminish. So the tendency is to go to smaller cells. In suburban and rural areas, 7 kilometers is the norm. Transmit powers. A base station typically transmits about 30 watts per sector. So that's no more than 100 watts for the whole base station. A handset typically transmits the order of 100 milliwatts. And here we've got to be careful because, as you know, there are concerns about the health effects of a cell phone. So that's a reason to keep this power level low, so that there are no problems. All phones used to transmit much more power, but now they've been coming down. So 100 milliwatts is pretty safe. Data rates. Today you can get with 3G systems up to a few hundred kilobits per second. Actually, with 3G systems, really, you can get possibly about a megabit per second, even 2. But this is in rare occasions. The total rate on a cell easily adds up to a few megabits per second. Still, this is not a lot if you think about what wireless systems do today. This is really nothing. They provide voice and data, and they operate exclusively on licensed spectrum. Dominant standards, second generation, we already talked about this, GSM, most of the world, and most of the class also. CDMA 2000, US, Japan, Korea, China, India, I heard, right? India, right? Growing strong. I didn't know that. And some parts of Latin America too. Now the emerging 3G standards, UMTS, which is replacing GSM, and CDMA 2000, which is an evolution of CDMA. Paging systems. These systems had, and I say had because they're on the brink of going away, cell sizes of 7 kilometers, even tens of kilometers. They use very high power. It's one-way communication. So the terminal, the pager, can only receive. It does not transmit, which actually makes the whole thing very inefficient because since it cannot transmit, it cannot report its position. So the system never knows where you are. So this is kind of amazing, but the way paging systems work is they page you all over the US. So if somebody sends a page for you, the paging signal goes out all over the United States because they don't know where you are. You could be anywhere. Extremely inefficient, but of course it's a very short message. It's only data, it's on licensed spectrum, and coverage is critical. You want to reach people wherever they are. Nowadays, they're being overtaken really by cellular. It's a long time now that I don't see anybody with a pager. They're really a dinosaur. But for a while, they were very popular. They really had them on the belt and stuff. These days, people just have a cell phone. Fixed wireless. I think I told you this already. These systems provide broadband access to residential and enterprise customers. They compete with DSL and cable. They're very similar to cellular systems, except the terminal is not portable. It's a rooftop or a sidewall antenna. And since it's fixed, you can actually point it towards the receiver and do some optimizations, which makes it work better. But other than that, So other than the fact that you don't move, they're pretty similar to cell phones, to cell systems. They use only licensed spectrum. Here's an interesting picture. Combined footprint in the US of cellular, paging, and fixed wireless base stations. An amazing total of 228,000 as of December of last year. You can see the amazing density in some metropolitan areas, right? Like LA, Bay Area, the northeastern corridor is just a big cloud. So a very large number of base stations, really quite staggering. Okay, let's talk about satellites briefly. Geo satellites, geo stands for geosynchronous. These are the ones that are used for satellite TV, like DirecTV type of thing, broadcasting. And they used to be used also for telephony, like intercontinental, but not anymore because of the delay. So these guys are up at about 36,000 kilometers, pretty far out. This idea was suggested by the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke in 1945. And it actually became commercially viable in the 1960s. The satellites are so high in the sky that with very few of them you can cover the whole Earth. In fact, I believe that with 3 satellites you can cover most of the Earth. So the problem is that since they're so far, the signal is very weak. So you need a large pointed antenna to pick it up, right? So for example, in DirecTV, you have the dish antenna on the roof. You just orient it towards the satellite very carefully, line it up, and then it works. There is a long latency of about 400 milliseconds, which makes it very bad for telephony, but it's fine for TV. Similar approach is used, although at an lower orbit, about 10,000 kilometers, by a company called Inmarsat. These guys provide maritime communication for like boats, and also for journalists, like in Afghanistan and stuff. That's how they report back, using Inmarsat. There is also something called OmniTrax, which is for track fleets. All these systems use high satellites. Data rates are very low, no more than 10 gigabits per second. They use only licensed spectrum. And the key is that since you want to be able to point the antenna, the satellite has to look stationary from the ground, right? So what they do is the satellite rotates exactly at the speed of the Earth. So even though it's moving around, it's moving with the Earth. So from the standpoint of view of us down here, it doesn't move, but it is moving. So those are the GEO satellites. Then in the 90s came the LEO satellites. So the vision here was to provide telephone communication using low Earth orbit satellites at about 1,000 kilometers, maybe 2,000. And the idea here was to provide coverage all over the world, right? Have a system that provided coverage everywhere, even on the oceans and on the poles and on the top of Mount Everest, etc. So what the idea was to have these network of satellites, and because they're very low, you need many of them. So for example, there are 2 systems that were launched in the 90s. There is Iridium, and there is Globalstar. And Iridium used 66 satellites. In fact, that's what's called Iridium, because that's the number of electrons in Iridium. And then Globalstar used 48. So very large numbers of satellites, which makes it very expensive, because what happens is that the satellites are good for a few years, and they have to be replaced. So very expensive, but pretty much it works as a cellular system. You can think of a satellite as a base station. It's a very large base station. And these satellites are moving around in different orbits. And, well, the problem mostly was the cost. So the phone also was pretty big. Here's a Globalstar phone. You can see the antenna is pretty large, because even though the satellite is only at 1,000 kilometers, that's still pretty far. So you need a big antenna. Battery consumption was pretty bad, so you would run out of battery very quickly. And then it was just too expensive. 1 minute of phone conversation with Iridium, I think, was costing up to $7 per minute. So it was really targeting only like businessmen and really people for whom cost was not an issue. But it was too much for the general population. So these guys went under in the 1990s. Although some of the satellites remain operational, they've been bought by other people. So that's about what I want to say for satellites, just some basic notions. Then something quickly on cordless phones. So cordless phones are private systems. There is no coordination between the bases. So there is no switch, essentially. If you think about the picture I showed you before, there is no switch here. Each little base goes straight into the telephone system. The cell sizes are small, a few tens of meters, just the size of an apartment or a house, that's enough. Transmit power is about 1 milliwatt. So when you have a cordless phone, it sends about 1 milliwatt, both the base and the handset. So think that a cell phone uses about 100 milliwatts, right? So even though they look the same, they look very similar, the power levels are extremely different. A cell phone uses about 100 times more power than a cordless phone. The data rate is usually 32 kilobits per second. And there are two dominant standards in the world. There's DECT in Europe, and there's PHS in Japan and China. And then there are gazillion proprietary systems, Sony, Sanyo, this and that. And probably most of you have these proprietary systems. They use unlicensed spectrum in the 900 megahertz range, I showed you before. Okay, let's talk about wireless LANs now. Wireless LANs are computer modems. They transmit just a few milliwatts, really. Remember that I told you that because this is unlicensed spectrum, there is a regulation here on the power, so you have to stay below a certain power level. Otherwise, you're breaking the law. The cells are pretty small, few meters, few tens of meters, although these days you can buy actually directional antennas that allow you to extend Wi-Fi range pretty far. But nominally, they're pretty short range. It's all unlicensed spectrum, and it's only data, although now voice over IP is coming soon. So in theory, you can run, and in fact, I've done it. You can run Skype over Wi-Fi, and it works pretty well. So you're cheating, and you're doing packet voice over the data network. The dominant standard, pretty much the only standard, is this IEEE 802.11. That's the name for Wi-Fi. There are three variations. The one that most of you probably have is the .B, .11b. There's a new one coming out now, which is G. So the B goes, let's see, goes up to 11 megabits per second. G goes up to 54. So this guy is much faster. And then there is something called A, which hasn't quite taken off, but it's out there, which goes up to 70. But most of you probably have B. Maybe some of you have G, but mostly B. Okay, Bluetooth. I've mentioned this before. I don't know if you guys know what Bluetooth is. This is kind of interesting. Bluetooth is a short-range radio that replaces cables. So my cell phone has it, for example. So I can have it, for example, I can synchronize my cell phone with my laptop, like the phone numbers, the Outlook, and all that stuff, using Bluetooth. If you have a digital camera, it may have Bluetooth too. So you can download the pictures without having to cable it. Most devices these days have Bluetooth. Most cell phones have Bluetooth. For example, for the headset, right? You can have a wireless headset, and you have the phone in your pocket, you have the headset on, and you don't have a cable running, just Bluetooth. So it's just a cable replacement. Also, for example, the printer. You can connect the computer to the printer using Bluetooth. So you don't have to lay a cable. It's short range, 2 meters. It uses unlicensed spectrum in the 2.0 gigahertz band. The data rate is 700 kilobits per second, 723 to be precise. And Bluetooth is peer-to-peer. So essentially, there is no base station in Bluetooth. So a device finds another device, and they just talk to each other directly. There's no need to go through a base station. It's peer-to-peer, and they can form small networks also. It is a standard widely supported by the telecom industry, and also the PC industry and the consumer electronics. There are over 1,000 companies that support Bluetooth. So pretty much everybody that builds something that is electronic has Bluetooth these days. And kind of a fine point, the name Bluetooth comes after King Harald Bluetooth, who united Denmark and Norway. So you can guess from that this was Uh, this was something that came from Northern Europe. In fact, this was initially an effort of Erksm and Nokia. So that's why they chose the name. Then we have another similar system, which is also is a cable replacement also. And this is this called ultra-wideband radio. It's a more sophisticated alternative than Bluetooth, more expensive, but it offers high data rates, up to 500 megabits per second, really quick. So for example, they're talking about using these to communicate, for example, HTTP, if you have an HTTP at home, or if you will at some point. For example, communicate it with your DVD recorder, that kind of thing, because Bluetooth is too small. You just couldn't go, like high definition video, you just couldn't go through Bluetooth, it's too much. So this would support something like that. Entertainment, video gaming, and things that are requiring more bandwidth. It's very efficient in terms of power. It's an impulse radio, so the way that this works is it sends these very short pulses, less than a nanosecond, extremely short. And just every once in a while. So most of the time it sends nothing, and then it sends these little pulses. So it is reminiscent of Marconi's original spark radio. So it's funny that we've gone sort of in a circle and going back to something that moves like a spark radio. Now that's what this ultra-wideband is. Because the pulses are so short, it uses a lot of bandwidth, up to 7 gigahertz. And in 2002, the FCC recognized its use as an underlay. So it makes it legal to use ultra-wideband on bandwidth that's licensed to somebody else, right? So it's pretty controversial actually, because some companies that have licenses are not happy with this. But in theory, these guys can use bandwidth that's licensed to other people. And a good thing about ultra-wideband is that it has a very low probability of eavesdropping because of this much bandwidth being used. And I won't get into details, but it does have this added benefit. Ad hoc networks. All I want to say about this is that the difference between an ad hoc network and an infrastructure system is that here there are stations. So all of these guys are equal. All are peers. There's no notion of base stations controlling phones, as in the cellular system, where we have this sort of master-slave structure, right? The base stations are the masters and the phones are the slaves. Here, everyone is equal. It's peer-to-peer. And there's no backbone infrastructure, so these guys are not wired to anything. It's all radio. And so topology is dynamic. Connections are dynamic. And so the military like this, right? They go to Iraq, for example, they don't have time to lay down cables and install base stations. They just have, every one of these guys can be a tank or a plane. They just form a network on the fly. They like it. It's all licensed. And this company I told you about, Metricom, they use this type of structure to offer wireless internet in the 90s. There's a new company now called IP Wireless, which is trying to do the same. Here's a chart that shows all these systems in terms of data rate. So we have here on the horizontal axis, we have bandwidth going from 0 to 6 gigahertz, and then we have data rate. So you get a feel for how they compare, right? So cell phones are here, right? In the order of tens of kilobits per second. 3G is here, with in a good day up to 1 megabit per second, usually less. Bluetooth is also here, close to a megabit per second. Ultra-wideband is way up there, 50, 100 megabits. Wireless LANs also, right? Very fast. Satellites are off the chart, high frequencies here, but very low data rate. Here's another one. Instead of rate, we compare range. So same thing, frequency in the horizontal axis. So ultra-wideband, extremely short range, 1 meter, 2 meters. Bluetooth, maybe 10 meters, and that's optimistic. Wireless LANs, right? 100 meters, and again, I'm being optimistic. Well, no, that's all right, 100 meters, that can be done. Cell phones, 1 kilometer up to maybe 10, 2G, 3G a little less probably. Satellites are up there. Now, in terms of power, so cell phones are here. That's the base station, of course. The handset is down here. Big difference, right? 30 watts versus 100 milliwatts. Bluetooth, it's about the same, 100 milliwatts. Wireless guns are higher. Mutual and Cosmos phones would be down here, 1 milliwatt, no power. All right, I think I talked about this already. This is something that they're doing in California, automated highways. So they're trying this out already. The idea is you have these cars that drive themselves without, so the driver doesn't have to drive. And the idea is that they arrange themselves in platoons. And so you have these platoons of cars that are very close to each other, and they communicate. So the platoons are constantly adjusting their positions, their speeds, so that they don't collide. And just to give you, the reason I'm bringing this up is that this is an application with specific QoS requirements, right? Here, errors and latency can be deadly, right? If you flip a bit, or there's too much delay in one of the packets, you can have a huge accident. So here, these type of requirements are critical. Also, it should be robust to network faults, right? If you lose power in one of the base stations, right, you can have a massive accident here. So you need to have some sort of diversity. And finally, I'm going to close with this, geolocation. This is coming up. This is going to be very big. So the idea is you incorporate GPS or GPS-assisted location technology onto wireless devices. And there are also other non-GPS alternatives, which are not as accurate. But GPS is getting very cheap, right? So this is actually mandated by FCC. It hasn't been effective yet, but it will be at some point for 911 services. So if you call 911 from your cell phone, they will not be able to pinpoint your position as they do when you call. If you call 911 from a fixed phone, they know where you are. So they don't have to ask you for directions. They come and find you. So they want to have the same for cell phones. You call for help, and just by placing the call, you give your location away. So what FCC has mandated is an accuracy of 50 meters 2 out of 3 times, and 150 meters, 96% of the time. So they want to have these accuracies of the order of 50 to 150 meters, which is doable with GPS. Now, on top of that, location allows for a plethora of commercial applications. And in the Far East, they're already doing some of this stuff. So the Koreans have something called body location. So you're going around in Korea, and you have a network of friends, like in MSN or something. And if some of your friends are around you, it's going to tell you. It's going to tell you, your other friend is here in a coffee shop or something. Or you can find where your friends are in the city, for example. Then there are also applications for e-commerce, right? For example, merchants can find you and offer you stuff. For example, you like sports, so you like you like to buy sports equipment. So you become active, and then you walk by a store that has a discount on Nike shoes, so they can send you a message saying, "Hey, come on in, that we have an offer or something." Also, you can use that to find movies or restaurants. You go on a trip somewhere else and you don't know the city. You want to find a restaurant or a movie theater. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do if you know where you are. So that's location. Now Verizon is offering service of driving directions. You can get a subscription. It's $4 per month or $1 per day. You get driving directions on your cell phone. You go to, I don't know, New England to see the foliage or something, so you don't get lost. On the cell phone? Really? You don't say. Those guys at Google. They're doing something, yeah? All right, so let me go through a quick summary and we'll be done here. I've told you a little bit about all these applications, and just the point here was to show you that they have very different QoS, quantity of service needs, in terms of data rate, latency, and error tolerance. And then I wanted you to understand that it's challenging to satisfy these QoS over a wireless system. Much harder than on a wireless system because of the fact that wireless systems are unreliable, capacity limited, and they're broadcast. We've seen that some applications are more amenable to circuit switching, especially voice, and most others to packet switching. And now this requires 2 separate networks, but there is a clear move towards a universal packet switching with just one network. Spectrum can be licensed, so you pay, you reserve your license, and then it's only yours to use. Or it can be a license, open to everybody except for the etiquette rules. We've gone through the 7-word concept, which is the cornerstone of most wireless systems. The idea is reuse bandwidth on different locations. You can continue with sectorization. We've seen that there are 3 levels of resource sharing in a 7-word system. There's duplexing, remember, separation of uplink and downlink. There is multi-access, separation of different users in the same sector or in the same cell. And there is interference management, how you reuse channels across different cells. We've seen that there's been essentially 3 generations of systems. From 1G to 2G, we went from analog to digital. Then we went from 3G, we're going now actually, from 2G to 3G by incorporating data and packet switching. 4G should be all packet switching, whenever that happens. And we've seen a classification of different systems. So what I've covered today is pretty much what you can find in chapter 1 of the textbook. So if you want to go over it on your own, you're welcome to do that. If you want another viewpoint, you can look at section 1.2 of the book. This week, we'll start math, so you'll have fun with that. You can read Appendix B2 if you can. It's very short, it's just like 2 pages. And it's a review of random variables. So we'll be needing a little bit of that. And it's really short, so I really encourage you to look at that on your own. Appendix B2, the textbook. And we'll be covering stuff that is in chapter 2. There are some sections that I'm not going to cover. So you may skip those sections. Don't worry about that stuff. But mostly, except for those sections, I'll cover most of chapter 2, hopefully next week. And if you want to look at the fundamentals book, it should be section 2.1. All right, guys, that's it for today. Right on time.